orchards and what have you. He bought the Fünfterhof for 60,000 marks in 1876. And that's where the family lived, and that's where he travelled to and from to oversee the various projects in and around Germany mostly, but also on one occasion he had to go to Austria, to Vienna, as part of a three-man team to be consultants to the Viennese, to advise them on sewage products and sewage systems for the city of Vienna. And the interesting thing is, although he went to Vienna as a part of a three-man delegation, he didn't seem to be able to fit in a trip to see the relations, my grandmother and her children, who were suffering hard times in the early 1900s, and but anyway, and the late 1880s. He and his children also never actually seemed to make a visit to Austria, which was interesting for us. Why that was? Germany is not that far away. It may have been due to work commitments, it may have been due to transportation, or maybe they didn't feel they wanted to show up and be here on the spot. Having said that, they certainly supported my grandmother's family. Each of the children, particularly Conrad, Bruce and Wilson, sent letters of support, sent donations also to my grandmother. So my grandmother was able to make ends meet due to the generosity of the Aird family, due to the children and the father, my great-grandfather, Alexander Aird. One has to remember that. Anyway, so they bought the property, the Fünfterhof, for 60,000 marks. And a few years later, in 1883, they had to sell the property. They had to sell it because the company went bankrupt in 1883. They suffered big losses. They had one building project in Munich alone where they lost 709,000 marks. They had to sell their beautiful family home, and they sold it for about 27,000 marks. Bought it for 60, sold it for 27,000. It was bought by the city of Danzig in the end. And the city of Danzig was so grateful for Alexander Aird in completing their canalization project. They not only built a fountain in his memory and in the memory of von Winter, the mayor of the city of Danzig at that time. They built the fountain, but they also allowed him to live in the family home for long enough to get over his financial difficulties, which he never got over. So eventually they had to move out. Now, I forgot to mention, in 1865, John Aird and Co., J&A Aird, suffered huge financial losses. So they had two things. They had the bankruptcy in 1883, and they had the financial losses in 1865. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. And according to the Conrad diaries, the 1865 financial losses were due to an unreliable civil servant who let them down badly. And they lost a lot of money. It doesn't tell me how much they lost. So they were weakened already in 1865, 10 years after Alexander went over to the continent to look after the J&A Aird project. Yeah, so those were really some of the key points of the life of Alexander Aird. He achieved greatly, particularly in the city of Gdansk. They gave him a lovely obituary when he died in 1910. But he died a very despondent man, a very heartbroken man, of ill health. He had cancer of the thyroid gland, and he died in Stuttgart. And his wife died a couple of years earlier in Oringen, just north of Stuttgart, also with health problems, quite bad health problems. And no doubt the bankruptcy and the financial woes that they had in the later years, in the last 20 years of his life, contributed to that. The children helped where they could, and Alexander continued to live in Germany. We don't know quite how many trips he made back to England, if he went back at all. But he was also, I must make a point of mentioning this, He was helped financially, the family was helped financially by John Aird, 1st Baronet. As you can imagine, he wouldn't leave his relatives destitute and in trouble. And John Aird, the 1st Baronet, we have it in writing in the Conrad Aird diaries, bailed them out or gave them maintenance money to keep them going during that very hard time. So Alexander Aird was being supported by his elder brother, which was quite natural, and as you could imagine. That is the story. Those are some of the key points of my great-grandfather Alexander Aird. Hope you enjoyed it. Hello and welcome back. I'm in my office now. I wanted to tell you the story about 10 years ago when I had pretty much exhausted everything that was on the internet about Aird, about our firm, about John Aird and Sons, about the J&A Aird enterprise on the continent. And I noticed a few references on the internet to books that were available in the library. So I went up to Salzburg, about an hour and a half's drive from here, and ordered half a dozen volumes of these building journals from the 19th century, quite thick books. And in those books were many references to the J&A Aird enterprises around Germany, also a little bit in Switzerland, a little bit in Austria. And I copied everything. It was great. It was a great interest. I mean, for example, here you can see I've highlighted all the references to Aird, to Alexander Aird, to J and A Aird, as you can see. And it literally goes into great detail about each and every project that they did, or at least that was recorded. And at one stage, much like the John Aird and Sons company in England, going into a different format, John Aird and Co, and then Lucas and Aird. Well, at one stage here on the continent, Alexander Aird, my great-grandfather, must have taken a partner on, because here you can see J and A Aird and Mark. So possibly Mark had something that Alexander Aird needed for a particular project, and so they joined forces in that particular case. So there's many things in this book that tell fantastically interesting stories. And it is great to see the name J&A Aird coming up time and time again. And many of these projects, they probably remained unknown by most of our family. And it was just down to my persistence in making sure that I found out everything about the family that I went to the trouble of going into the library. So a big feast of detail on the European John and Alexander Aird projects. In German, of course, and I don't quite understand most of the jargon about the building that they did and so on and so forth, and the measurements and the budget and the basis on which the deal was occasionally done. And quite often you see the name General Enterprise coming up. For example, Alexander, when he did the when he completed the canalization of the city of Gdansk, had a deal with the local authorities and the mayor, Mr. von Winter, whereby he was given free lease of a sewage farm in Gdansk. So he had, I think, 10 years of making use of a sewage farm, which he did, and he grew vegetables and he grew flowers and plants, and he sold those as well, or that was the idea behind it. But unfortunately, in the middle of that 10-year cycle, the J&A Aird actually went bankrupt. So there's a little bit of a halt in the proceedings. But it was interesting to see how a lot of these building firms did their deals. You know, it wasn't always based on we get paid immediately. Sometimes it was, well, we'll do the job first, and then you can see whether you can pay us in installments. And needless to say, on that kind of basis, much like the Aswan Dam project for the first Baronet, John Aird, whereby the work was done first of all, and then many years later, the firm John Aird and Co. were paid for it. So a lot of risk, obviously, goes into that with the political situation around the globe and potential for war here, there and everywhere. Here is a little section where it refers to the Danzig company and the bankruptcy. It's all contained here. It's all written here. It's fantastically interesting. And right at the back, there's several articles being written by Conrad Keith Aird. Conrad, one of Alexander's 13 children. It's amazing to think that he had 13 children. Anyway, the diaries of Conrad. Here's the first one that we actually got into our hands. A lot of it is written in the old style German, and I had to get quite a bit of this translated. But the fascinating facts that came out following getting the translation done gave me a very good insight. This diary was basically from 82 to 86, and Conrad was born in 1865 in Brunswick. His father, Alexander Aird, had a contract with the royal family, the Kaiserliche family, the emperor's family in that part of Germany, and they gave him a contract to build water towers, waterworks in the city of Brunswick. And he was allowed to live in Schloss Richmond, in the Richmond Palace, not in London, but in Brunswick. And it was during his stay, and I think it was many, many months, they had the splendour of living in Richmond Palace, the family. Conrad Keith Aird arrived. So Janet Keith gave birth to Conrad Keith Aird at Richmond Palace in Brunswick. That's the kind of lifestyle that they led. They'd been in Copenhagen for 2 years. They moved to Berlin. They had a project in Brunswick, and so they moved and lived in Brunswick. And at the same time, they sent their children to various schools. You know, they had pretty good education. So that was interesting, this particular diary. Now, these diaries are fascinating, these next two, because, let me see, is it 2 or 3? Here we are. Conrad Keith Aird put together these 3 diaries from the period 1914 to 1918 approximately. So we originally got these confused with Auntie Florence's diaries, and we thought that she had done them, these diaries. And we were wondering why there was such great detail about battlefield positions in the First World War.